In the cold dawn, within the echoing halls of Hampton Court, a hush shivers through the palace. For years, England has held its breath, longing for a male heir to anchor the tumultuous legacy of Henry VIII. Now, on the morning of October 12, 1537, the air trembles with exultation and dread. Prince Edward is born. The royal bedchamber is heavy with the scent of lavender, mingled with the subtle hints of sweat, blood, and hope. Courtiers press their palms and faces to gilded walls, eavesdropping on muffled cries, some out of joy, others from a superstitious fear that fate might yet snatch this child away, as it has so many others. You watch the king stride forward, chest swollen with pride and relief. For Henry VIII, this is more than an heir. This is validation. Years of personal upheaval, papal defiance, and the devastation of 2 dead wives hang like ghosts above the cradle. But as young Edward coos beneath the velvet canopy, his fragile form cradled by trembling hands, it soon becomes clear this child will inherit not only a throne, but a kingdom fractured by religious strife and personal anxieties, wounds not easily healed by a single shivering life. Legend weaves through the court that from the very start, Edward was not the robust infant for which Henry had prayed. They say he was born weak and small, fussing less lustily than political peace might demand. Yet the official proclamations roar with confidence. The king has a son. Bells ring, cannon fire shatters the morning, and civic feasts fill the capital. Beneath this jubilation, though, midwives and physicians whisper of the queen's protracted agony. Jane Seymour, his mother, lingers on. Is she dying? Some officials insist it is only fatigue from birthing a healthy boy. Others tell of panic behind closed doors. The queen fevered, the prince pale and gasping. Historians still debate just how severe Edward's neonatal frailty was. The Tudor need for strong heirs meant that any sign of illness would be strategically concealed, replaced by carefully crafted bulletins. Some claim later portraits are exaggerated, designed to show an almost angelic strength. Was it all pageantry? Did the hasty public christening, barely 2 days after birth, betray an unspoken terror that the prince might not live long enough to be properly named? Inside the nursery, the atmosphere is thick with expectation. Nurses' fingers tremble as they swaddle the baby. One wrong move, and the fear of curse or contagion lingers. The faces of Edward's caretakers, watchful, drawn, reflect the psychological intensity of royal succession itself. Each time Edward coughs or fails to suckle strongly, the room stiffens. Perhaps in those very moments, the infant absorbs the anxiety that shapes his destiny, a destiny overloaded with hope, political calculation, and a sense of dread. For Henry VIII, this son is not merely blood of his blood, but the quivering fulcrum upon which England's religious and dynastic chaos precariously balances. Life, for Edward, begins not with freedom, but with the constriction of royal necessity. The shrouded celebrations, the ever-present potential for disaster, and the emotional volatility of the court leave an invisible mark. Long before the prince can speak, laugh, or even recognize the faces that hover above him, he is exposed to the psychological weight of a dynasty on the brink. The great feasts and church processions that follow his birth are less acts of joy than ritual displays of collective relief and private terror. Remember, too, that in the background, Jane Seymour fades. Some say of puerperal fever, others of a nameless affliction. Her death 12 days after Edward's birth deepens a shadow over the nursery. Motherless barely past infancy, Edward is raised in an environment where loss and longing intermingle. One must ask, did the prince, motherless from his earliest days, inherit more than a crown in a crisis? Perhaps here, in this echoing cradle, lie the foundations for patterns of vulnerability, suspicion, and a deep yearning for control, traits that would ultimately shape not just Edward's brief life, but the very nature of his haunting death. Now the months slip by, sunlight glinting on silvered furniture and tall, windowed corridors. Prince Edward's nursery is a sanctuary and a fortress, its velvet drapes muffling not just the drafts of winter, but also the rumors that flutter ceaselessly through the palace. You watch as nannies in somber livery tread softly, mouths pressed tight, wary of a sneeze or raised voice. Every minor illness sparks a crisis. Every cough is examined for portents. The child's world, radiant with golden embroidery and painted panels, is also severely circumscribed, its luxury a reminder of what is risked, not for his own comfort, but for national destiny. This is no ordinary childhood. Even at play, Edward is observed, his toys chosen as much for moral instruction as for merriment. Wooden blocks depicting scenes from Scripture line his shelves, while tutors hover, eager to correct him, to guard the royal mind from corruption. The young prince stares through latticed windows, the outside world a mystery rippling beyond his reach. He is raised to rule, but not to truly belong to the world he will someday inherit. Even his companions, select boys chosen from noble families, are not strictly friends. They are reminders of what can be lost, replaced at the slightest sign of illness, a fact Edward cannot help but notice. Historians disagree on the degree of Edward's isolation. Some state he spent more time with physicians than with children. Others argue the household swelled with carefully screened playmates, lest a single infection destroy England's hopes. What is clear, and resonates through every remembered hallway, is the tension between the court's obsessive protection and the child's buried longing for ordinary connection. Every measure taken to preserve him, the layers of silk, the patent medicines, the round-the-clock watchers, heightens his sense of otherness. For young Edward, the psychological toll is subtle but relentless. The gentle pressure of the king's wishes weighs as heavily as the more tangible constraints. "You are your father's answer to a nation's prayers," whispers an elderly nurse, smoothing his brow on feverish nights. The boy grows increasingly precocious, memorizing Scripture, absorbing both Latin and Greek before most children master their own tongue, yet friends with no one but his tutors and attendants. Laughter rings quietly, if at all. When he writes, even in childish scrawl, there is a tightly wound perfectionism. Every page is checked twice, every phrase is pondered, as if failing a lesson might somehow imperil the very throne. There is more. The shadowy threat of illness stalks the nursery like a predator. "No one enters unwashed," decrees the apothecary. Even his toys are scrubbed in vinegar, their painted faces faded from excessive care. When the death of his half-sister Mary's beloved pet is reported, caution spikes anew. What if such contagion crosses the guarded thresholds? When the occasional cough rattles through the palace, a fever pitch of vigilance ensues. Curtains are drawn tight, and the fresh air so necessary for a young boy is considered too risky. The psychological paradox grows. The more Edward is protected, the less real protection exists from loneliness or gnawing dread. A monumental event underscores this reticent childhood, the formal presentation of the prince to the council in 1543. At 6 years old, Edward stands before an array of grim-faced men, his posture exact, his words drilled and clear. The effect is striking. A child already rehearsed in power, already trained to subdue himself to an audience. Yet beneath the ceremonial, one senses his unease. Was this formative exposure to the all-seeing gaze of authority a source of pride, or the first stirrings of surveillance-induced anxiety that would flavor his brief reign? Curious speculation persists around his relationship with a rotating corps of guardians and mentors. Did Edward truly trust any of his nurses, or did he learn from infancy to conceal his discomfort, to keep his deepest fears and dreams masked behind the polite smile of statecraft? All the while, the kingdom outside grows more dangerous and unpredictable, its people restless, its counselors whispering of plots and rival claimants. Inside the nursery, the curtains are thick, the air sometimes achingly stale. The boy prince, wrapped tightly in silk against an unseen chill, is watched every moment, protected from assassins and infection, but never from the solitary chill of being both cherished and imprisoned. As Edward steps haltingly into adolescence, the air at court is electric with unseen menace and whispered plots. The grand portrait of the late King Henry VIII looms from the corridor, eyes stern and unyielding, a perpetual reminder of discipline, ambition, and paranoia. Edward cannot escape his father's shadow, nor, it seems, does anyone else want him to. You see the echoes in every bow, every guarded conversation, as rival factions circle like wolves denied a direct way to power. A child of 9, Edward becomes the unintentional epicenter for backroom intrigue and ancestral grievances. The king's absence, Henry's death in 1547, leaves a sudden vacuum, cold and vast. In official ceremonies, Edward is styled as lawful inheritor of England, France, and Ireland, yet around him hungry eyes gleam, noblemen, clerics, and royal kin, all intent on capturing the direction of the new era. The boy's coronation, conducted with meticulous ritual, is a moment of both triumph and foreboding. Some recall the ceremonial crown, nearly too heavy for Edward's small head, and the scepter trembling in his unsteady hand. That image, of a pale child weighted by the regalia of sovereignty, haunts collective memory, symbolizing weakness as much as promise. A major event unfolds quickly: the creation of the office of Lord Protector, granted to Edward's uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, theoretically guardian of the boy king. In truth, Somerset exploits his nephew's innocence as political shield and tool. Edward, trained to revere obedience and caution, feels the pressure of daily lessons and public pronouncements. Yet uncertainty simmers beneath Somerset's reforms: the Protestant zeal, the rough handling of dissent, countryside rebellions sparked by enclosure and overtaxation. Here, a psychological insight. Edward's emotional compass is warped by constant reminders of betrayal, loyalty, and the fallen fates of rivals. He is counseled with tales of Richard II's imprisonment, Henry VI's madness, and Edward V's disappearance. All boy kings, all undone by factional strife. These are not bedtime stories but cautionary blueprints. Within Edward blooms a dangerous duality: outward compliance, inward unease. His writings become more circumspect, his friendships more transactional, and his laughter, now a rare currency, carefully rationed. Historians still debate the degree of Edward's complicity in the machinations that swirl about him. Was he, as some revisionists claim, a silent strategist, lending approval to Somerset's more radical religious reforms and property seizures? Or was he largely a bewildered pawn, consciousness stunted by protocol, his will bent by seasoned manipulators too practiced to resist? Contemporary accounts from disgruntled courtiers suggest an uneasy blend. The prince is sharp, yet vulnerable; eager, yet cowed. The truth remains obscured by the careful construction of narratives meant both to protect and to direct the realm. Rival factions, the redoubtable John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland, the Queen's dowager ambitious Seymour relatives, spin webs around the young king's psyche. Each presses in, whispering counsel, warning of hidden daggers. It is a world where trust is currency and betrayal almost expected. When Somerset is arrested in 1549, accused of misrule, Edward is forced to sign documents against his uncle. The task costs him more than mere ink. It hints to him at the price of power, the necessity of emotional self-sacrifice, the importance of never appearing weak. This constant shifting of alliances hammers away at whatever innocence remains. Days are now measured in wary glances, coded language, and the exhaustion of unrelieved vigilance. The boy who dreamed of chivalry and learned Greek now entries into his journal only the most sanitized of details, perhaps fearing that even the privacy of thought might be breached by ambitious readers. More subtle still is the effect of his late father's legacy. Henry VIII's own paranoia, suspicion, and rage have fertilized a court soil in which no child could truly flourish. Edward absorbs the lesson, if not consciously. Then through osmosis, the shadows that crept around his cradle now press against his bedchamber doors. In the swirl of ghosts and power, the divide between self and mask draws ever thinner, and in the pale candlelight, England's lost boy king learns to navigate the dangers of both the living and the dead. The court wakes early, stirred by the ceaseless clatter of boots and the rustle of velvet as counselors converge. In the center of this maelstrom sits Edward, newly crowned and newly vulnerable. A king, yes, but a boy no less, thrust onto a throne built atop the bones of fractured faith and ambitions. Now only 9 years old, his slender frame is drowned in ermine and crimson silk. The weight of the crown is real, its cold metal pressing a circle of responsibility into his scalp. A constant reminder that childhood has ended before it truly began. You observe Edward during the first council meetings. He sits straight and still, face carefully void of the childish playfulness that lingers in private moments. Those around him watch for signs. Will he be pliable? Or will the iron will of a Tudor emerge? Publicly, he reads proclamations with clarity beyond his years, but his eyes seldom rest, flitting from one lord to the next, searching for reassurance and hidden intent. Every decision is shadowed by the uncertainty of regency. Who truly rules England, the king or those gathered at his table? A significant event soon shatters whatever illusions may have remained about who wields power. Only months into Edward's reign, rebellion erupts. The Prayer Book Rebellion in the West Country and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk. The country is convulsed with rage, fueled by religious reforms led by Somerset and enforced in the king's name. Edward must watch as men are hanged, villages burned, and the church's riches redistributed according to policies he is made to endorse. Somerset claims the changes are wholly necessary. Dissenters are branded traitors. Even as petitions for mercy reach the king's chamber, Edward is surrounded by adults whispering that mercy is weakness, that the House of Tudor did not win its crown by losing nerve. The psychological effect on Edward is profound. In his private diary, unremarkable for its brevity and reticence, he notes the events of executions and revolts in plain, almost clinical language. This day rebels were put to death. Yet historians wonder, peering at these carefully neutral lines, is this detachment or a coping strategy, a mask worn against the horror of knowing his signature means suffering for so many? In the span of months, the childish empathy narrows, replaced by perfectionism and a desperate urge for control. Still, debate churns among scholars. To what extent did Edward support these harsh measures? Was the king developing his own ruthless streak, or simply echoing the rhetoric pressed upon him nightly by those who claimed loyalty? Some suggest his religious fervor, more radical even than Henry's in his pursuit of Protestant purity, was the only domain where Edward dared show enthusiasm, compensating for his inability to direct the politics around him with zealotry where permitted. Court life does not soften. You overhear the endless negotiations for his affections, the subtle competitions among noble women tasked with entertaining the king, all wary of being replaced at the first hint of a rival's ascendancy. Edward becomes more guarded, more calculating. He learns the importance of secrets, of writing nothing that cannot be burned, of trusting no one fully, not even the faces that tuck him in at night. The tone of his letters changes, words chosen with the carefulness of a seasoned diplomat. He grows thinner, physically and emotionally, each week, the boy in the garden fading into the king in the council. The pressure grinds on. Lavish masks and lessons in music are interspersed with lessons in suffering, in suspicion. Edward, once trained in Greek and rhetoric, now practices defense, how to read faces for disloyalty, how to phrase questions that reveal more than they ask. The king's gaze hardens, and a certain isolation settles, deep and chilling. And through it all, you sense the growing wedge between his ideals and his ability to shape reality. Remember the lessons of constant surveillance from childhood? Now, that vigilance mutates into a young monarch's unwillingness to trust even his own instincts, haunted always by the knowledge that real power may never have truly rested in his hands. Fever clings to the palace air like an invisible fog, seeping into every tapestry and corridor, curling behind door frames and heavy curtains. Now, as Edward enters his early teens, his body becomes a perpetual battleground, unruly and unpredictable. You see the change first in the subtle things, the sheen of perspiration on his brow, the increasing moments when his voice trembles, or the way he hesitates on the stairs, hand gripping the banister until the color drains from his knuckles. The shadow of the sweating sickness, a mysterious scourge that has decimated Tudor England in waves since the 1480s, haunts every cough, every shiver. The court's physicians, a revolving cast of solemn men with bottles of syrup and lurid theories, regard the young king as both patient and experiment. Each proposes new treatments: bleeding, herbal tinctures, sweetened cordials, poultices of rosemary and vinegar. Edward submits, obedient and grave, even as he grows wary of every new remedy. Sometimes he resists. Whispers reach the council chambers that their king is tired of the taste of mercury, or the cold shock of a morning purge. The more they doctor him, the weaker he sometimes appears, and the more their faces grow drawn and anxious. A significant event draws their anxieties into sharp focus. In 1552, Edward is struck with a violent fever and cough, possibly pulmonary tuberculosis, though the sweating sickness is always suspected. For weeks, the court is locked down, its usual noise muted by dread. No one publicly speaks of death, for England's future, Edward's life, is too precious for such frankness. Instead, there are nervous prayers, candlelit vigils, and hasty reports smuggled to Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. Only the twin drumbeats of hope and terror remain, echoing through every chamber. It is in this feverish crucible that Edward's psychological suffering is forged anew. The king grows obsessed with purity, moral and physical. Cleanliness, frequent hand-washing, the burning of bed linens, and rare outings into the raw air become daily rituals, as if these acts might fend off the creeping rot. The court follows suit, their anxieties feeding on his. Every shadow cast by a wavering candle exaggerates the suspicion. Is this a simple chill, or the first sign of an irreversible decline? The fear is not only for Edward, but for themselves. For what would become of their fortunes, their faith, their children, should the king perish? Yet beneath this visible anxiety lurks another fear, rarely voiced but deeply felt. The enemy within. The king's own body is seen as treacherous, an unreliable vessel for greatness. Do his repeated relapses signal a weak constitution inherited from his mother, Jane Seymour, or a curse brought on by decades of Tudor bloodletting and intrigue? Historians question whether some of his more dire symptoms, night sweats, delirium, sudden bruising, might have been complicated by poisoning or misapplied treatments, rather than simple infection. Some chroniclers note that the fear within the palace sometimes seemed more acute after each physician's visit, not before. The psychological consequences for Edward are subtle yet harrowing. The discipline and perfectionism that once defined his studies now harden into an almost compulsive self-scrutiny. Every slip, a mispronounced lesson, a trembling hand during Mass, feels laden with potential consequence. Inwardly, the king comes to fear not just contagion, but his own vulnerability. He writes prayers in trembling ink, drafts treatises on virtue as if they could armor his failing flesh, and looks to the faces of his physicians for news they dare not give. You sense his growing terror, not that he might die, but that he might die powerless, misunderstood, a failed vessel for the mythic hopes of England. Still, the debates rage. Was Edward's illness truly inevitable? The legacy of a sickly childhood? Or the final, fatal outcome of relentless psychological stress? Of living always in anticipation of disaster? Did the rituals of cleanliness and caution help? Or did they amplify his sense of doom? A kingdom's paranoia distilled into the lonely nightly sweats of a boy who was never free to simply be unwell. One thing is certain. Each fresh fever, each agonized convalescence, chips away at both his body and his fragile faith in what the future might hold. In the deep watches of the night, few in the palace can escape the awareness that their king, a boy so carefully insulated, so precariously preserved, is as mortal and as alone as any peasant trembling in a thatched cottage far from London's haunted halls. You glimpse the candlelight flickering late against the stone walls. Edward, still hunched over a table long after choral prayers have faded, inscribes careful notes in Latin and Greek. Even as illness gnaws at his strength, the king's intellect blazes. His tutors, grown gray and weary, marvel at the boy's capacity for languages, scripture, and philosophy. Some describe him as a scholar king in miniature, imbued with an uncanny spiritual seriousness. Yet listen closer. Beneath the surface brilliance there is unease, a mind sharpened not only by curiosity, but by insomnia, self-doubt, and a dread of imperfection. A singular moment occurs in the spring of 1552. Edward presides, frail but composed, over a public disputation between Protestant and Catholic theologians. He listens, probes, and sometimes intervenes, citing scripture from memory, weighing fine points of church doctrine. Observers are struck by his composure. He seems at once detached from his age, prematurely grave, yet also strangely absent, as if watching himself from a removed height. Embodied in this episode is both his intellectual mastery and the emotional gulf opening beneath him. The counselors applaud, yet some exchange wary glances. Is the king cold, or simply afraid to seem weak? Is this spiritual zeal, or a child's desperate need for control over the uncontrollable? The psychological paradox is profound. Edward's education, the palace's pride and project, was intended to produce a strong, wise sovereign, one who could mend the wounds left by Henry and deliver England safely into a new era. Instead, it forms a mind overly alert to sin, to danger, to the fragility of all things. The child who once played quietly, watched through curtains and tapestries, now pores over treatises on mortality and Protestant martyrdom. He writes of the afterlife with a fervor that chills those summoned to read his private prayers. Privately, Edward begins to fear not only death, but disgrace. The horror of leaving a legacy marred by unfinished reforms, or, worse still, by the triumph of Catholicism. The cousinly rivalry with Princess Mary sharpens his anxieties. The memory of his father's tyrannical swings between mercy and cruelty deepens his perfectionism. Every day he feels the shuddering question, am I strong enough? Is faith enough? He dreams, some say, of plagues and betrayal. His closest servant records that the king sometimes wakes screaming, eyes wild, unable to remember what he has dreamed, but certain that danger is near. Historians disagree about the depth of Edward's religious passion. Was it youthful fervor, the product of relentless indoctrination, or was it sincere conviction? A boy's mind, left lonely and unanchored, grasping at the only certainty left to him. Some suggest Edward's written works, so mature and rigorous, were partly curated by his tutors to impress the council and foreign ambassadors. Yet no editor could fully erase the trembling margins, lines of private prayer, or scraps of anxiety that slip between the polished arguments. The atmosphere grows tenser as Edward's health wanes, but his mind refuses rest. His writings darken, sermons take on the cadence of prophecy and warning. He imagines himself not merely as ruler, but as chosen by God, and thus agonizingly responsible for every setback. You sense the torment distilled. The walk between the garden's sunlit lawn and the sick room's shadows is never longer than during these haunted months. It is during these fevered nights that loneliness becomes most acute. Edward is smothered by the immediacy of his thoughts, tormented by the legacy he may not survive to secure. His acute awareness of mortality, of faith, of England's precarious unity, deepens the divide between mind and body, public accomplishment and private terror. The king, celebrated as a prodigy by outsiders, soon comes to resemble more a solitary monk in a gilded cell than a triumphant sovereign. Remember how his childhood solitude was enforced by fear of illness? Now it returns with greater force, transformed into an adult isolation, sharpened by the very brilliance once prized by the court. The scent of rain and ink lingers together as the corridors echo with tension. Edward's gaunt face, now unmistakably that of a fading boy, becomes a fixture at every council meeting, a living ghost presiding over power struggles he can no longer hope to steer. You watch as John Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland, edges ever closer to the king's bedchamber, eyes fixed on the sickly monarch with a predator's restraint. Letters, secretive and fevered, pass between Dudley, Princess Elizabeth, and nervous ambassadors. Somerset, the fallen protector, has vanished, executed by the very machine meant to preserve the king's innocence. A chilling historical turning point. By early 1553, it is clear that Edward is dying. His cough deepens, episodes of breathlessness return, and blue shadows darken beneath his eyes. Still, the council tightens its web. Dudley engineers a series of radical new bills, presenting them for the king's signature while he is too weak to stand. Edward writes shakily, his Protestant conscience desperate to leave something lasting, his hand directed by men who care less for his soul than for stopping a Catholic succession. Some mornings the king's signature trails off, and courtiers must fend away rumors of imminent death. Within the bedchamber a newer torment takes shape. Manipulation replaces comfort. Dudley brings his son Guilford before Edward and suggests a solution. The succession must pass to Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's Protestant daughter-in-law, rather than to Princess Mary or Elizabeth. The council preys upon Edward's deepest anxieties, reminding him of his church, his reforms, the danger that Mary, staunch Catholic, would undo everything. Weary, frightened, yet desperate to believe his suffering has purpose, Edward yields. Historians still puzzle over these final machinations. Was Edward conscious through it all, a tragic agent in forging a Protestant future? Did Dudley and the council amount to little more than opportunists, deploying Edward's convictions against him at his weakest? Conflicting accounts color the king as, alternately, a resolute architect of succession and an overawed, manipulable patient, his worldview narrowed by illness to the bitterest dogmas. The king's isolation deepens, not just from the council but from those he might once have considered kin. Elizabeth stays distant, wary of political fallout. Mary's letters grow infrequent and tense, physicians hover, their remedies growing more desperate and invasive. Bleeding, cautery, even potions imported from Venice and Spain. Each day brings a new medicine, a new form of ordeal. To the court, Edward is already half a relic, his presence necessary for legitimacy, his agency vanishing. Within his heart, fear is joined by a sense of futility. He writes in the margins of his Bible, "Lord, let this cup pass from me." The phrase is a whisper of both humility and terror. Dudley, Somerset before him, and the rest, have made Edward's body a battleground for ambition. The king's mind, so fine and restless, now writhes beneath the betrayal it cannot fully admit. What choice did he truly have? Would any decision avert disaster? You sense the psychological collapse. The young king's last assertion of will is to enforce purity, even as he is stripped of basic comforts and confidences. The final weeks are marked by a deep resignation. The sound of curtains being drawn, of voices hushed at his door. The cold compress of isolation around both his limbs and his soul. Guilt and fear coil tightly. Was protection ever real, or a more elaborate form of custody? The answer recedes as his eyes glaze, haunted by the knowledge that death, long held at bay by ritual and obedience, has now fully entered the palace. And in the corridors, the engineers of doom lay plans for England's next uncertain dawn. July 1553. The palace is thick with anxiety and the sour metallic tang of fear. Through windows prized open for fresh air, you hear only whispers. Edward's condition has deteriorated beyond doubt. Skin waxen, lips split, breathing shallow and ragged. Physicians, clinging to routine, bleed him once more. Some say his cries are muffled by the determined hands of attendants desperate to fulfill their charge. Others maintain that by now he has slipped into fevered delirium, haunted by visions no courtier dares describe. The echo of his agony, witnessed only by servants and anxious doctors, fills the palace with dread. A fateful event unfolds. Edward's death is officially publicized on July 6th, but rumors sweep London days before the declaration. The nature of his death, and its sheer drawn-out horror, shock subjects up and down the land. Not for Edward the silent slipping away of an anointed king, but, as some chroniclers recount, a gruesome tableau of suffering. The boy king's body, wasted and covered with sores, is said to have bled from the mouth as he gasped for breath. A few witnesses will quietly claim this was consumption. Others, perhaps mindful of Dudley's ambition and the court's desperation, whisper of possible poisoning. In the oppressive gloom of his chamber, tapestries dull with dust, Edward experiences moments of lucidity punctuated by agony. He tries to pray, his trembling lips forming verses half remembered from a mother whose face he cannot recall. Sometimes he rails, a tangle of fear, regret, and desperate hope for God's mercy. In these last hours, denied the comfort of familiar faces and the dignity of peaceful rest, his death becomes not just a medical tragedy, but a psychological ordeal. The horror is compounded. The dying king is forced to wrestle with an absence of solace, the suspicion that every soothing word is a lie, every touch a political calculation. Historians remain divided on the cause of Edward's torturous end. Was it truly tuberculosis, then called consumption, or some swift, virulent strain of the sweating sickness, gruesome in its symptoms? The popular imagination has never quite accepted the official explanations. The nature of his lesions, the bleeding, the rapid decay, accounted for by some as careless medical treatments, by others as evidence of murder. Factions have always found it convenient to invoke the specter of poison, especially given the obvious motive. Dudley stood to gain everything if Edward's death allowed the engineered succession of Lady Jane Grey. Even more debated are the psychological effects of this drawn-out dying. What must it be, after years of anxious seclusion, to face death surrounded not by kin or loyal friends, but by strangers who watch the clock and whisper of inheritance? Edward then, more than ever, embodies the tragedy of kingship in its cruelest guise. Utterly alone, his mind circling back on itself, fighting for meaning in pain. Remember the rituals of childhood, the hypervigilance, the self-scrutiny bred through years of seclusion. All now return in distorted form. Edward tries to order his thoughts, to give his suffering a narrative, yet meaning dissolves amid the fever dreams and betrayals. His brief reign culminates in this terrible liminality, neither a sovereign in command of his fate, nor merely a child free of consequence. The corpse of the king becomes a final battleground. His funeral is a muted affair attended by few, the grandeur of state somehow hollowed out by scandal and uncertainty. The faces at the bier are taut, and the wailing is half-hearted, as if the kingdom itself knows there is no healing at hand, only a deepening wound. In the days to come, Lady Jane is briefly crowned, Dudley acts, Mary rises, and the realm tears itself anew. Yet no one who saw Edward carried away, cheeks sunken and breath already gone, forgets the psychological shadow his final days have cast over England. Edward VI's death, suffused as it was with both physical horror and psychological isolation, stands as one of the darkest moments in English royal history. Not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about the perils of power, expectation, and the burden of inheritance. Raised in an atmosphere of relentless anxiety and strategic mistrust, Edward was never simply a victim of biological fate. Instead, he became the embodiment of Tudor fears, the vulnerability of a dynasty built on fragile bodies and fractured loyalties, the human toll exacted on a child when history's weight is pressed too early and too long. His story compels us to reconsider how psychological forces shape not only individual lives, but the very destinies of nations. We see in Edward's final decline the results of obsessive protection gone awry, the loneliness bred by privilege, and the unimaginable costs of living as a symbol rather than a person. The questions his suffering leaves behind echo through the corridors of history. How many rulers and how many ordinary lives have been shaped or shattered by the invisible burdens we pass on in our pursuit of legacy or survival? In Edward VI's haunting end perhaps lies an enduring warning about the dangers of isolation, the complexities of inheritance, and the ways our struggles with vulnerability can shape the fate of entire peoples.